Hey, what's up, guys? Today, I wanted to talk about a small town in North Carolina called Sylva that has some interesting history, along with some legends from around the area. Apparently, there were Tartarians, vampires, and giants here. And I actually came here because there's this very popular vampire story associated with the city of Dillsboro, which is the neighboring city of Sylva. It's basically the same city. I was originally going to make a video on this, but as I was making the video, I decided to do a full video on vampires first, so if you haven't seen that, make sure to go check it out. But yeah, it's not just legends of vampires and giants that we're going to discuss. I also wanted to talk about another creepy out-of-place tunnel here that was even creepier than the last tunnel in Valhalla. So yeah, lots of cool things to talk about. Get cozy, and let's dive into some alternative history involving Sylva, North Carolina. Well, let's start off with the mainstream history of Sylva. It's a beautiful mountain town in Jackson County, North Carolina, sitting on land that the Cherokee held long before any settlers wandered in. They had spots like Tuckasegee Town, a few miles from what's now Webster, until General Griffith Rutherford torched it in 1776 during the American Revolution. After that, European settlers started showing up, and by 1853, Jackson County was put together from chunks of Haywood and Macon counties. Webster got picked as the first county seat, named after Daniel Webster, some big-shot politician, and sat there for years with a courthouse built in 1854, rebuilt after a fire in 1888. Supposedly the railroads came in during the 1880s. About 3 miles from Webster, a new place called New Webster popped up because of the rail line, only to get renamed Dillsboro in 1889 after William Allen Dills, a local guy who must have mattered to someone. Seems weird that you would start a new city 3 miles away and make it a new version of the city when Webster was only a few decades old. Unless it's actually older than that, that would make sense. Sylva, they say, started in 1879 when a wandering handyman named William D. Sylva stumbled into Judge Riley Cannon's place in Webster. The story goes that Cannon's son-in-law, General E.R. Hampton, built a house and a mill near Scotts Creek, and his little girl May liked this mysterious Dane so much she named the new post office Sylva in 1880. The town got official in 1889, and the railroad brought logging and mining, pulling it ahead of Webster. Though you gotta wonder how much of that tale is just a made-up story that they tell us. It is interesting to note that Transylvania County is nearby, so that is quite the coincidence that you would have a city named Sylva, meaning forest in Latin. Not to mention, as we will see, the connection to vampires in this city. By the late 1800s, Sylva was growing with sawmills and the Cowee Tunnel, as apparently there were bigger plans for the area. But tunnels don't just dig themselves after all. The whole Cowee Tunnel story is kind of ridiculous, but we'll get to that in a moment. Webster was still the county seat, but its luck ran out in 1913 when a fire trashed its business district. Another fire completely resetting the city. So of course they tell us that Sylva jumped at the chance, and a vote in May 1913 moved the county seat over. Seems pretty convenient. Dillsboro, despite its railroad, didn't really get a chance to take off. Sylva had the tracks, the mills, and now the spotlight, setting up what they'd tell us was the town's big boom moment. And now we get to the Jackson County Courthouse, the main attraction of the town. It went up extremely fast, built from August 1913 to March 1914. C.J. Harris, a clay-rich local, and Marcellus Buchanan, for some reason donated over a hill at the end of Main Street. Frank P. Milbourne and Richard Sharp Smith put it together with red brick and limestone trim for $30,000. It opened in 1914, ran the county until 2011, and now sits as part of the library. These are two huge architects, with Milbourne also being the architect behind the Anderson County Courthouse, and Richard Sharp Smith was the leading architect for the Biltmore. Both these guys are pretty busy and have a large list of buildings in their portfolio. Now let's start here because this is really the only building of interest in the town, and it was built in 1913, so it's not like it wasn't possible or anything. But there are some things that are kind of weird about this story. Well, first, the hill, which they say is a natural hill, but to me, it could very well be an old Indian mound. Now let's keep in mind, there are countless mounds in this general area, and like I said, this is old Cherokee land. As we will see, I think it's not too crazy to consider that many cities were built on top of previous ones, or at least used the infrastructure that was already there. There is one construction photo, but something about it seems off. Like I said, I do think it's totally possible that they constructed this, but the fact that there's only one construction photo is strange. The first thing that sticks out to me is the hill, which half of it is cut grass and the other half is grown out. The entire building looks off-centered as well, with a large portion of it being underground. There is also this pillar or object sticking out of the ground here. Unfortunately, the quality of the photo is too low to be able to see this in detail. But the weirdest part is there seems to be a door at the bottom of the hill or some type of entrance. This photo overall is bizarre as there's mixed resolutions and artifacts. Not sure if it has been edited as the quality is too low to be able to decide that, but it's just overall suspicious. Why would you take a photo at this stage and no other stages? The only other early photo I could find is this one, and now the pillars and portico are up, but this does not look like a new structure at all. It also seems like it's buried a good 10 feet or more. And then yeah, this is it all finished. And compare this photo to the construction, you can see how off-centered it is. It's a very beautiful courthouse with a view of the entire city. And there's also a Civil War monument here which was put up in 1915. Supposedly 3,000 people attended the dedication of the Civil War monument, but it looks like under 100 in this old photo. Also, for some reason this photo has people painted on the street, which is very suspicious. They wanted to make it seem like it was busier than it was. So it seems this is the photo that was used for the background of the group photo for the unveiling of the monument. It's like they just photoshopped the people on the street and then used a different version of this group photo. So that is proof that they were pasting different photos together, and they were doing some type of early photo manipulation with a bunch of these early photos. I ended up finding one more photo of construction. However, for some reason they photoshopped the people into the scene as their proportions are off. Let's keep in mind that in 1920, the population was under 1,000 from what they tell us, so it could have been even less than that. So why would you build a county courthouse here with such a low population? In 1900, there were only 300 people. Something seems off. Now in the modern day, there are still less than 3,000 people, so it is a small town, but just interesting to note. Now, is this structure on top of an old Indian mound? Who knows? But that old photo with the door is strange, and it doesn't seem natural to me, but that's my opinion. Also, these big name architects are another red flag, as you will see this with a lot of courthouses and old revival structures, is they just kind of have an architect that they assign them to, with these huge portfolios that seems unrealistic. Richard Sharp Smith is also the architect behind the Madison County Courthouse, which features a similar design. However, there is contrasting info where some articles say it was constructed in 1912, and others stating it was built in 1907, and this one for some reason took 4 years. No construction photos, and it's in another random small town called Marshall, with a lot of interesting buildings, yet the population in 1920 was 748. Just doesn't quite add up. So let's just say it took 4 years for this structure. How are we to believe that the Jackson County Courthouse was built on a hill in 7 months? Seems unlikely. So yeah, that's the courthouse. Very beautiful and unique. Not too many courthouses like this stand on a massive hill over the city. It's extremely photogenic and really stands out as an iconic landmark. There isn't much I wanted to discuss in terms of the downtown buildings. It is worth mentioning that they go below street level. You can see this in multiple places where windows are beneath the street, and many storefronts have stairs that go down another level. You see this in every downtown, which is strange because it means the streets needed to be raised. That brings an extra level of complexity to creating these cities, and there is no evidence or photos of this process, which is bizarre. Now let's talk about Dillsboro, which is different than Sylva. They're right by each other, but Dillsboro is the older town which used to be New Webster, and is the city associated with the vampire legends that I brought up in the beginning. There isn't really much here, just a few shops and places to eat. There's a nice creek here that's relaxing near the railroad. This railroad leads to the Cowee Tunnel, which isn't well known. I'm sure some locals know about it, but it's not like they advertise this history that much. And it is difficult to get to, but there's an entire story behind this tunnel that I found strange. And we honestly thought this tunnel was far creepier than the Stump House Tunnel. I'm not sure exactly why. It could be because there was no one out here, and the Stump House Tunnel had a bunch of people there, but this one just had a bad vibe. You also had to cross this really sketchy bridge in order to get here over the Tuckasegee. The tunnel is massive. The official story of the Cowee Tunnel is that it was built between 1882 and 1891 by the Western North Carolina Railroad to connect Murphy to the rest of the state. They tell us convict labor did all the work, specifically black prisoners from eastern North Carolina who were arrested for minor offenses under the black codes. We're supposed to believe 120 prisoners with hand tools carved through solid mountain rock. Then there's this whole accident story. In December 1882, Renfro Construction supposedly put a bunch of chained prisoners on a boat to cross the Tuckasegee River during a winter storm. The boat capsized in the freezing waters, and 19 convicts drowned. Local stories say many more died, but since these were convicts, they might not have given an accurate count. Some versions mention different details, but they all end with prisoners drowning while chained together, unable to save themselves. The lack of documentation is another red flag. For such a major engineering project, there are no construction photos. There are just a couple photos showing men standing around, nothing showing the actual work. No blueprints or technical drawings available to the public. No clear records of who exactly these convicts were or where they came from. The convicts supposedly fell into the freezing cold water, and because of the shackles and chains, it was difficult for them to keep themselves afloat and prevent themselves from sinking. In some accounts, these prisoners were actually considered dangerous criminals, so they wore very heavy chains. Which again makes this whole entire story seems ridiculous, so they carved out a tunnel with heavy chains on their ankles and a chain gang? Keep in mind, it's called the Crying Tunnel because supposedly, you can hear the sounds of pickaxes of the convicts hitting against the rocks, and the men crying from being whipped and then drowning in the river. Okay, so they were being whipped the entire time? Not sure if I buy that whole story. The tunnel was allegedly used until the 1980s and then abandoned. Now it just sits there with water dripping down the walls. This massive engineering project just left to rot. This connects with the Swannanoa Gap Tunnel, as it is the exact same story with convict labor. And actually, one of the photos that is used with the Cowee Tunnel of convict labor is from the Swannanoa Tunnel, so we don't even have pictures of the convicts at Cowee Tunnel. When you stand inside Cowee Tunnel and look at the actual construction, it's hard not to wonder if we're getting the whole story. The scale of it seems beyond what chained prisoners with hand tools could accomplish in the 1880s. Maybe they did build it, but the whole narrative just feels like it has too many convenient gaps and too little evidence. Maybe there was an older tunnel already here that they just expanded, or maybe the construction methods weren't what we've been told. All I know is I kept thinking, yeah, there's no way this was built by 100 convicts. but that's just my thought. I understand that you have to consider dynamite, but even with explosives, the unstable mountain terrain makes it extremely unlikely. They actually don't even mention explosives being used. In fact, it says they had to manually bore through 700 feet of stone. Oh, and there is a portion in the back, or maybe it's the entrance, where it says 1929, so apparently they must have came in 50 years later, added cement and some metal framing inside, but most of the tunnel's pretty unfinished. That's another strange thing about it, is why wouldn't you just clean up the tunnel a bit from the beginning to make it more stable? Okay, and there is another really weird angle to all this. It's not really alternative history, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So there's this film called The Fugitive from 1993, and it's literally a film about a man who is wrongfully accused of murdering his wife, prison transports, and a cover-up conspiracy. In the film, they used practical effects for the train crash scene, and the wreck is still there, so it's pretty cool to see. But I just find it so weird that they decided to use this specific location. It's less than a mile away from the tunnel, which I'm sure they were aware of the history, so it just seems bizarre. Not to mention the movie involves a pharmaceutical cover-up, but I'm not going to go into that. Another thing I should mention is that Cowee is said to be a Cherokee name, tied to older settlements around here. They don't really say why they called it the Cowee Tunnel. Just slap the name on and move on, I guess. But there was a historic Cherokee town called Cowee up near Franklin, about 20 miles from Sylva, with a platform mound where they built a townhouse right on top, which feels a lot like what happened with Sylva's Courthouse Hill. That townhouse spot wasn't some random choice. It was a big deal for them, a center for meetings and ceremonies. So naming the tunnel Cowee probably nods to that old Cherokee presence, even if they don't want to spell it out. However, Cowee is an anglicization of the Creek word Coweta, which means the mountain lion people. The story they give us that the Cherokee sided with the British in 1776, either to keep settlers off their land or some other reason they can't quite agree on, and that's why colonial militias, like Griffith Rutherford's crew, came through and burned their towns to the ground. Cowee got hit hard that year, along with Tuckasegee near Webster, and a bunch of others. They call these places middle towns or just villages, but it's fishy. Almost every little mountain town around here started as a Cherokee settlement, and they all got wiped out the same way. Platform mounds, townhouses, whole communities torched, and we're supposed to buy was just about picking sides in a war? Sounds more like someone wanted them gone. Take the lost city of Tuckasegee, which is basically Webster. It's the same deal, burned in 1776. No real ruins left, just stories about it being a middle town. But if Cowee had a mound and a townhouse, Tuckasegee could have too, maybe even bigger than they let on. There's actually this insane book from 1681 called Natural and Moral History of the Antilles Islands of America by Charles de Rochefort, and it describes something seriously mind-blowing about an advanced Appalachian civilization that used to exist in Florida and the Carolinas. What's fascinating is how detailed and advanced this civilization was, way beyond what you'd typically expect from mainstream historical narratives. According to Rochefort, by the 1600s, the Appalachians had a sophisticated form of government and were fully knowledgeable about European history and politics. Apparently, a group of French settlers in the area got completely wiped out by the Spanish, except for a handful who managed to escape inland. These survivors were taken in by the Appalachians, and their civilization was so impressive that the French decided to stay permanently. There's even an engraving in the book showing what these Appalachian towns look like. Surprisingly European, complete with 2- and 3-story buildings. But here's the wildest part. At the center of this culture was an ancient temple of the sun, built at the top of a mountain called Olaimi. Rochefort gives extremely detailed descriptions, and despite European hesitation, he calls it a cave, but admits the precision and symmetry clearly indicate something man-made and extremely advanced. It's obvious we're dealing with a grand temple, not just a natural formation. Even in the engraving, it is depicted as a grand temple. The floors are described as polished to perfection, made from a solid piece of stone without seams or cracks, looking exactly like marble. The walls and ceilings were adorned with patterns and shapes resembling coral and elaborate carvings, giving the whole structure a sacred and majestic feel. According to local Appalachian tradition, this temple was not just ancient, it was pre-flood. They claimed it was literally constructed by the sun itself, making it the only structure in their lands to survive the Great Flood. This isn't a minor detail either. The temple had perfect symmetry, an incredible central altar directly under an opening aligned with the sun, and polished surfaces that reflected sunlight in a deliberate, ceremonial way. It's clear that the Appalachi revered this temple deeply and maintained it as a sacred site for thousands of years. The book also describes some seriously advanced textile making techniques, mysterious and vibrant flowers used in their rituals, and their profound understanding of herbal medicines and craftsmanship. But there's another mind-blowing detail in this book. Rochefort openly writes that the French colonists who interacted with the Appalachi firmly believed that they had stumbled upon the remnants of the Tartarians. He mentions it was actively debated but became increasingly accepted among them that the Appalachian Tartarians were, in fact, one and the same. When you put all these details together, the advanced architecture, the pre-flood myths, the sophisticated culture, and the identification with Tartaria, it seriously challenges mainstream historical perspectives and raises massive questions about our understanding of North American history. With that in mind, now let's get into vampires. So this story has to do with Dillsborough, which is why we came here in the first place. Now it's interesting because this story takes place in the late 18th century, in the 1780s. The issue is that Dillsborough, or originally New Webster, wasn't a town until 1853. So if the story is true, that would mean there was an earlier town in this area before New Webster, which is possible as we've discussed. Okay, so the story goes, in the spring of 1788, a man named Dr. Alfred arrived with his family in the small, sparsely populated community then known as New Webster, North Carolina, renamed Dillsborough in 1889. They purchased land and constructed an impressive home near the Tuckasegee River. An isolated area in the dense forest of the Great Smoky Mountains seemed like an unusual choice for a successful physician, which interestingly was rumored to have a royal lineage. Nevertheless, when Dr. Alfred opened his home office and apothecary, people from miles around sought his services. Initially, everything seemed fine. However, two men whom Dr. Alfred had treated for gout suddenly died from unknown causes. Both were well-liked, productive members of the town, and their deaths raised suspicions. Everybody was starting to freak out, but the local minister managed to calm the community, reminding them that life is uncertain and that death can come at any time, as per God's will. Life returned to normal for a few months, until that fall, when the minister's wife entered their children's room and saw what she described as a dark figure hovering above their young daughter, who had been in perfect health when she went to bed. The woman screamed, and other household members came running, but the toddler was dead. There were no obvious signs of illness or injury, other than a small amount of blood on the pillow from 2 puncture wounds on the child's throat. Something was clearly wrong. Reports emerged of a huge bat-like creature flying about at night, a winged being so large it seemed otherworldly. People began securing their homes, closing doors and windows, and families huddled together, afraid to leave their children unprotected in separate rooms. A few nights later, a young boy raced into town, frantically knocking at his grandparents' door. He insisted that something was attacking his mother and father in their house up the hill. The grandfather gathered some neighbors and a small group of men hurried to the house, where they found the boy's parents and 2 young daughters dead, each with puncture wounds on their necks. The surrounding communities were alerted, and over the next few days, the hills and valleys were thoroughly searched, but nothing unusual was discovered. By February 1789, residents began to relax somewhat, though they continued to keep their children close and avoided going out alone after dark. They convinced themselves that whatever had terrorized their town had moved on. Then one evening, screams were heard from a house halfway up the hill. Neighbors arrived just in time to see a black, human-like form race down the hill and disappear into the Alford home. Inside the house, they found a young couple dead, with strange bite marks on their throats. A vigilante group quickly formed and confronted Dr. Alfred at his home. He refused them entry, prompting some men to stand guard outside while others fetched reinforcements. By morning, a large group of townsmen forced their way into the Alfred's residence. Dr. Alfred attempted to reason with them, but they dragged him outside and tied him to a tree. Upstairs, they found freshly made beds that appeared unused or not slept in at all. In the cellar, behind a heavy locked door, they discovered 3 coffins. And one lay Miss Alfred, dressed in a black, shroud-like garment, very much alive, and when they confronted her, she began hissing and cursing as she was pulled from the coffin. But the interesting thing is that the couple's 15-year-old son was nowhere to be found and managed to escape. The leader of the vigilantes addressed the gathered crowd, declaring that the Alfreds were unnatural creatures who fed on the blood of the living. Dr. and Miss Alfred were hanged, their bodies placed inside the house, which was then set ablaze. Their son was never seen again, and no further unusual deaths occurred in the area. I found that to be an intriguing story, and there are varying opinions online as to how true it all is. Some people claim that the story has been edited over time, adding more modern descriptions of vampires. But what stuck out the most to me is that the Alfred family were descended from royalty. Now obviously many people would assume that vampires are not real. Check out Vampires Unveiled if you haven't seen it. But the connection to royalty is interesting because this could have been a generational ability that had been passed down through their lineage, some type of occult practice of astral projecting out of the body and feeding on others' primal energy. That would explain the black figure, which could have been some type of manifestation of the vampire's spirit leaving their bodies back home. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of the story is its mention of a town in North Carolina during the 1780s called New Webster. That in itself is odd because there really shouldn't have been much in this area during that time, especially not a place that would attract a wealthy, supposedly royal family. Why would someone of such stature wanted to relocate to what was essentially the wilderness, unless there was already some sort of established community or infrastructure here? If the story is true though, I doubt it was called New Webster at the time. New Webster was renamed Dillsboro much later, when Jackson County was formed and the original county seat, Webster, was established in 1851. It's strange to think that there would have been both a Webster and a New Webster simultaneously, and only a few years apart since the original founding of Webster, unless the area's history goes back even further than we realize. Maybe there's some hidden truth here that we haven't uncovered yet. I try to keep an open mind, but I will admit that opinions on the legitimacy of the story are mixed. Still, it's worth exploring because the story is so detailed and many locals know about it and even joke around about the idea of vampires in the area. Remember, it's called Sylva after all. Okay, now let's talk about giants because this gets really interesting. Not far from Sylva is Judaculla Rock, a soapstone well known for its ancient carvings and petroglyphs. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It was even on the History Channel. It's popular because this rock is linked to the Cherokee account of Judaculla, a slant-eyed giant who is associated with the landscape, landforms, and even Cherokee towns. The Cherokee called this giant Judaculla, which we now pronounce as Judaculla. According to their stories, he wasn't just some random monster. He was essentially a master of all game animals in the mountains. He lived inside Tsuneguni, which we now call the Tennessee Bald, or some say Basalt Mountain. The giant's domain wasn't just a cave, it was described as an entire town inside the mountain. Interestingly, this is not the only mountain with this legend. There is a mountain called Devil's Courthouse, And we actually went on a hike here during Christmas. It was beautiful. I referenced it in an earlier video, but I just wanted to show a few videos from the hike. It was snowing and all the trees were white. We actually didn't know it was going to be snowing, so it was colder than I expected, but it wasn't that bad. I just remember looking at the Devil's Courthouse formation and thinking it looked like another Indian head formation, but that could just be me. It was cool to view it from the bottom and then hike up to the top. It didn't take long at all, and then you got these gorgeous views of the entire area. Oh, and there was a fairly large tunnel up here. It didn't seem that old, but I still walked through it a bit before hiking up. But yeah, this mountain was where Judaculla held court. Apparently, there's an underground chamber beneath the rock where the giant would dance and hold meetings. Seems oddly specific. And sure, you could say it's just a legend, but I feel that there's more to this story. Because it gets even deeper. Judaculla wasn't just a legend, it was an account of a master of the game. There's another story where a girl from Canoga on Pigeon River married Judaculla after he proved he was a great hunter by bringing deer to her mother. The mother freaked out when she finally saw him because he was so massive, his head touched the ceiling rafters, while his feet scraped the opposite wall. The description says he had long slanting eyes, which is where the name Tsukalu comes from. That's an odd detail. Why would you just add that if it's not specifically describing the attributes of this being? Not just that, but he had 7 fingers in which he scratched the rock to make the petroglyphs. What's weird is how many stories connect Judaculla to disappearing settlements. The Cherokee account tells of an entire town called Canasta on the French Broad that vanished into Tsuwatelda, Pilot Knob. 2 strangers showed up one day claiming to be of their people and invited the whole town to come live with them inside the mountain where they'd have peace forever. The entire settlement packed up, fasted for 7 days, and then followed these mysterious guides into a cave that opened like a great door in the side of the rock. Inside, they found an entire country with houses arranged in long rows. The story says that the mountain people had prepared houses for them and told them that the Ani Hayun Tikuwalaski, the Thunders, lived at the very top of the mountain. The settlement was never seen again, supposedly still living inside Tsuwatelda. This matches a pattern we see across Appalachia, stories of entire settlements that vanished, often connected to mountains and giants. It's strange how many of these tales have similar elements: fasting to see the mountain people, doorways and rock faces, and underground towns. The Judaculla rock itself is bizarre when you actually see it. The carvings don't look like anything recognizable, just a mess of symbols, cut marks, and weird lines. Archaeologists date it to at least 3,000 years old, which means it predates Cherokee presence in the area. The official story is that the markings are Judaculla's footprint or territorial map, which is interesting because they had a plaque at the rock that showed all the mounds in previous Cherokee settlements. The rock sits in this remote valley farm that feels off somehow. Apparently the owner of the land found this rock in the 1930s. It really makes you think if there are more rocks like this out there that just haven't been found yet. So were there actually giants in these mountains? The Cherokee certainly thought so. But the origins of Judaculla and the surrounding place names go way deeper than the Cherokee stories. According to research by Richard Thornton, Judaculla isn't even a Cherokee word originally. It's actually an anglicized version of the Cherokee pronunciation of Muskogee Creek words Sudakura, which means sky over Kura. Kura was a Proto-Creek province in the area. This makes a lot more sense when you look at the actual petroglyphs. Most of the carvings on Judaculla's rock appear to be dots and circles representing stars, planets, and galaxies, literally the sky. The lower third shows symbols representing major towns in the region. Many of these same symbols can be found in petroglyphs in North Georgia, Bronze Age Ireland, and Scandinavia, and even in It's a Maya writing from Mexico. What's bizarre about the area around Sylva and Cowee is that none of these place names are actually Cherokee in origin. Tuckasegee River comes from the Muskogee Creek Tokasegee, meaning descendants of the freckled people. The Tokaree were apparently very large-framed people, sometimes reaching 7 feet tall, which explains the giant stories. Also, Cora was traditionally remembered as being founded by freckled, red-haired giants who arrived in boats and introduced the long-haired highland cattle to the region. Cowee itself isn't Cherokee either. It's an anglicization of Curaria, an ancient Irish word meaning place of the Cura people. Colasaja nearby has the same root. It's actually the Creek tribal name Cullasi with a Cherokee locative suffix. Same for the Cherokee Currahee. The timing doesn't add up either. According to colonial records, Cherokees didn't even enter the Tuckasegee River Valley until 1745. When they arrived, they encountered villages of Spanish-speaking white men with long beards, hairy chests, and dark skin, who worshipped a book. The Cherokees reported to Charleston that they had killed or driven off these people. That means that the Judaculla Rock was already ancient when the Cherokees first arrived, not part of their heritage at all. The archaeological evidence suggests that tall, European or Eurasian people had been in these mountains way before the Cherokee. In fact, archaeologists dated mine timbers at several ancient mines in western North Carolina to between 1585 and 1615, decades before Cherokee presence. A British official named James Moore reported that when Cherokee slave raiders first entered the Murphy, North Carolina area in 1692, they encountered and killed Spanish-speaking men with long beards. So it seems like the entire region around Sylva, Cowee, and beyond was home to a mix of peoples that included Proto-Creek tribes and possibly European or Eurasian settlers long before the Cherokee arrived. The Cherokees basically moved in, took over the existing settlements, kept their names, slightly changed, and then created their own stories about giants to explain these strange place names that had no meaning in their language. But I was looking at this plaque that shows all the Cherokee settlements and mounds in the area, and we noticed this one that said Cowee Mound, and since it was the closest mound, we wanted to go check it out. After searching online, there really wasn't that much on it. However, the map on the plaque gave a fairly precise location point because it was by the river bend. The only thing I could find is that apparently, this mound was at the current location of Western Carolina University. Right where the Killian building sits, there used to be a mound and a city here, and the town was occupied in the 1650s. The mound was supposed to have been a pyramidal mound, so why would they destroy it? And is there a reason they chose to build the university right here on top of the site? Seems strange. And there are many areas around the campus that I felt like weren't natural hills, so there could still be remnants of even other mounds. The whole story of the campus is strange when you think about it. So let's assume there was nothing here by the time the university was founded. Why would they have the university all the way out here during this time when there were no currently occupied settlements in this area? Sylva is about 6.5 miles away, so it makes no sense to actually build a university here unless there was some type of remnants of a village and or infrastructure in the area, meaning they found a city. They didn't start anything. There are a few interesting buildings, like the old Madison building that was built on a hill in 1904, and then for some reason they tore it down in 1930. They even have this old photo of what they call the old steam plant, which consisted of a boiler that was pulled by oxen from Sylva to Cowee. So again, seems very overcomplicated to get set up here, and this is 1910. They still didn't have a railroad set up to Cowee. Here's the new steam plant, which is the oldest building still on campus. Apparently this is supposed to be new in 1924, but it doesn't look new to me at all. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there are still mounds in this area. or that the real reason they founded the college here was because there was some type of city remnants in this location. However, we have to consider what these words mean. Tuckasegee is the anglicized form of the Muskogee Tokasegee, which as we discussed means the descendants of the freckled people. The actual name of the Uchi tribe was Tokaree, which is archaic Gaelic Irish for elite people or nation. These people with red hair and freckles were extremely large framed, sometimes reaching 7 feet. This is the source for the Judaculla legends, which is again another anglicized word of a Muskogee word, Sudakura, the sky of Akura. If Cowee, North Carolina was actually the place of the Kura people, the cow people or nation, it would make a lot of sense on why this place was chosen and inhabited by later peoples. Kura with 2 R's is also the Irish goddess of fertility. It would seem that an advanced group of people inhabited this area long before we're told, but their existence has mostly been erased from history. Their foundations became the sources for many towns and cities we see today. The evidence is literally in the names. We just have to pay attention. Who knows what else is hidden beneath the surface, or how deep this hidden history really goes. All I know is it doesn't match what they tell us in the mainstream historical narrative. Thanks for watching, guys, and we're going to keep exploring new cities, so please tell us what you would like to see next, or if you have any info or stories to share. If you could leave a comment or tell a friend about us, that would really mean a lot. All we can hope is that our minds will be unveiled.
Let go of everything you think to be true. Relax the mind and ask the question, do I truly understand what this reality is?